id Software is without doubt one of the greatest pioneers of the first-person shooter. It's no exaggeration to say that they essentially invented the FPS genre that we think of today as 90s FPS games. During the 90s themselves, however, these games were known by another name entirely: Doom clones.
Yes, Doom is the one game in the id Software stable that almost always gets all the credit for inventing the FPS formula that ruled the 90s, but it certainly wasn't the first FPS id made, and it's very far from the first FPS. Like Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but perfected it for the modern world, id took an existing idea and polished it into something that still tops video game rankings to this day.
Before we can get to Doom, however, we need to take a look at the game that laid the foundation for it. That game was Wolfenstein 3D.
Hi, I'm DX.
And I'm Ethos, and this is our collaboration project, First Person Shooter, a deep dive series that explores the constant evolution of story versus gameplay in FPSs. Wolfenstein established the basic formula right from the start. The game was set during the Second World War. You fight Nazis. Back then, that was really all the motivation anyone needed from their video games. When you actually play Wolfenstein, there is as close to no story as possible to get without stripping the actual game of its assets. Most storytelling happens in the head of the player. You start the game with a knife in hand, a dead guard in your cell, and only one way out. You leave the cell, knife the next guard, and take his gun. It's very obvious that you have to escape this place. There are enemies everywhere and an exit nearby. If you keep working your way through the levels, you'll get out eventually. When you beat the very last boss of the game, Wolfenstein 3D ends with you opening a door and for the first time seeing the outside world. A single flat texture that looks like a horizon. As you walk towards it, the camera swings around and you see your character leap towards freedom. That's it. From start to finish, there was never really any explanation about why you were there. You just had to get to the elevator at the end of each level until you escaped the castle. Now, Wolfenstein 3D does have a story. It's even a relatively detailed one. To get that story, however, you have to do something which was pretty typical of older video games. That's right, read the manual. The manual lets us know that we were an allied spy by the name of J.B. Blazkowicz, who is incidentally the ancestor of Commander Keen, the star of an earlier id Software game series. In fact, the original PC version manual has spoilers in the scant few pages of the various episodes. I think that the choice of World War II as a setting saved id a lot of storytelling headaches, simply because people had already come with the knowledge of that conflict. No one was asking who the guy in all the Hitler pictures were. However, the little shrivels of story was basically irrelevant to Wolfenstein as a game. It's completely possible to play the whole game without knowing any of the story, and I'm pretty sure that there were plenty of people just like that. The acid test is really whether a game still works when you strip away all its story elements away and replace them. You can easily just change all the sprites and textures in the game and make something new without having to adapt anything else. In fact, earlier modders did just that with reskins of Wolfenstein 3D featuring Barney the Dinosaur and Beavis and Butthead. To understand how parallel and inconsequential the story elements were to the actual gameplay, look at something like Magic the Gathering. You can strip away all the fantasy lore and swap it out for sci-fi, horror, or South Park without changing the game mechanics. The story adds character and flavor, but it's completely optional. That's true for the small dab of story that Wolfenstein 3D had. Proportionately, I can't really claim that Doom was any heavier in story than Wolfenstein was, and by modern standards, it definitely has the bare bones of a story attached to it. But with the release of Doom, we can already see that id made a better use of story in their game. The story and setting of Doom is not yet essential to the core of the game itself, but as many inferior Doom clones that followed demonstrated, you need to do more than just copy the tight gunplay and hyperspeed violence of Doom in order to match its experience. The atmosphere and setting made a huge difference to that experience. The explicit narrative was still missing, but through the eyes of our silent protagonist, we can see a world that just feels more alive than Wolfenstein did. Wolfenstein certainly suffers much less damage when you take the Wolfenstein bits away from the game. The role of story and lore has not yet taken center stage in the world of first-person shooters yet, but id planted its seeds in its first smash hit that would drive other developers to treat the narrative parts of their shooters as more than just a formality. Now they had to care about the total package and the total experience. This was just one of the many ways that Doom was a literal game changer.
By late 1995, there were already a number of first-person shooters out on the market, most of them deserving of the title of Doom clone. It wasn't until January of '96 that the genre saw its first major departure from the formula that Doom had perfected. Duke Nukem 3D gave the first-person shooter something it didn't know it wanted: a voiced protagonist.
Hail to the king, baby.
No longer were you playing as a nameless silent space marine, you were playing as Duke fucking Nukem, an ass-kicking, lady-loving narcissist who was going to make those alien bastards pay for shooting up his ride.
Those alien bastards are gonna pay for shooting up my ride.
While Duke Nukem 3D's more dynamic gameplay and reality-based level design were enough to set it apart from Doom visually and mechanically, I think Duke himself is what had the biggest effect on the player, even if they were unaware of it. Duke Nukem is, for better or worse, an actual character. Duke certainly had a mind of his own with his impeccable sense of humor and uber-macho action hero personality. It's at this point that the dynamic between a shooter's gameplay and story shifts further, because you could take the game out of Duke, and he's still Duke. But if you take Duke out of the game, you have no game. On 3D's main menu, you can find a single screen giving you the story, and right off the bat, it's presented as an immediate sequel to Duke Nukem 2. Now, do you need to play Duke Nukem 2 to enjoy 3D? No, but the game makes it clear that it's the adventures of this character and not a blank slate whose entire existence originates when you press New Game. By presenting the very concept of continuity and giving Duke such a robust personality, the game gave smaller merit to the idea that a story within a shooter was largely inconsequential than every shooter that came before it. If you've ever boasted about having balls of steel, then Duke Nukem 3D worked. The concept of a voiced protagonist going on an adventure would continue to be used in later FPS games, but Duke Nukem 3D began this trend with an entry that was nearly perfect on arrival.
Much better.
The only thing Duke Nukem 3D claimed to have, but actually didn't, was the third dimension. Always the overachievers, it was id Software that jettisoned us into the next logical step in the evolution of shooters. Games such as Duke Nukem 3D, id's own Doom, and various other shooters toyed with the idea of a three-dimensional space where the protagonist and enemies maneuvered around, But it wasn't until Quake that this illusion became a reality. 3D acceleration was upon us, and the days where you could aim your shotgun at a wall and hit an enemy that was perched on a ledge were over. In this new environment, the mouse became the control of the land, acting as your trigger and camera. You could view objects, enemies, and the landscape from any angle without distortion. It was an entirely new world, accompanied with a new control scheme and levels of depth previously unseen. One of the only things that didn't change was how id approached the game's story. It's practically non-existent within the actual game, and one has to refer to the manual to learn the game's plot. What starts out as a seemingly innocent project to teleport people and cargo via portals called slipgates is sabotaged by an enemy codenamed Quake, who uses his own slipgates to insert death squads into military installations. Once again, you're not given a name or any lines. You're a blank slate, and while you'd think this isn't too far off from Wolfenstein 3D or Doom, I'd argue that it's substantially different, and this is an effect that would linger on for years to come. John Romero once said that the reason Doom Guy didn't have a name is because Doom Guy is supposed to be you. Assuming this ideology extends to Quake Guy, or Ranger as we now know him, the consequences of a three-dimensional environment on such ideology are of crucial importance. Quake oozes atmosphere with its medieval, gothic, and science fiction-infused levels, but it's the ability to properly explore and interact with them that brings the player closer to the game's reality. Previously, entire buildings and walls would shift and scale oddly if you looked at them from an improper angle, but not in Quake. And this didn't just change the way you saw the game, it changed the way you played it. You were inherently more aware of how close an enemy was, and better able to gauge and estimate where your shots were going. Coupled with the silent protagonist angle, and you had the first three-dimensional shooter that was intentionally designed with the immersion of the player in mind. This would be the foundation of first-person shooters for years to come as they continue to perform renovations on the house that Quake built. And with Quake, we've arrived at the end of an era. Goodbye, Doom clones. Hello, first-person shooters.